So I was sitting there the other day, staring at my savings account balance, and I had this moment where I just started laughing. Not because it was funny, more like that kind of laugh you do when something is so frustrating that crying feels too dramatic. My balance had gone up by maybe $30 since the previous month. $30. And I remember thinking, okay, I did everything right this month. I didn't eat out. I brought lunch to work. I skipped the coffee shop. And $30 is what I had to show for it. That is the moment I started seriously questioning whether saving money, the way we've all been told to do it, is actually broken. Welcome back. If you're new here, this channel is basically me, someone who grew up with zero financial education, trying to figure out money from scratch. I'm not an expert, I'm not a finance guy, I'm just someone who's tired of being confused and started actually thinking things through. Today, I want to talk about something that kind of shook me when I sat with it long enough. The idea that saving money, the advice we've all been given since we were kids, might not actually work the way we think it does. And before you close the video thinking this is going to be some doom and gloom rant, stick with me, because I actually ended up somewhere kind of useful by the end of this. So let's start with the advice itself. Save your money. Put money aside every month. Build an emergency fund. Contribute to your retirement account. We've all heard this. Parents say it. Financial advice videos say it. Teachers who somehow managed to work money into a math class said it. The general idea is simple. You earn money, you spend what you need to spend, and then whatever is left over, you save. That's the formula. And on paper, it makes complete sense. If you do that consistently over time, you build a cushion. You eventually build wealth. You stop being one car repair away from a crisis. I genuinely believed in this advice. I thought the reason I wasn't saving was that I just needed more discipline, that I was spending too much on stuff I didn't need. And maybe that was partially true. But the more I started actually running the numbers in my own life, the more that story started falling apart. Here's what I mean. The classic saving formula goes something like this. Income minus your necessities equals what's left over. And that leftover is what you save. But for a lot of people my age, that equation is producing a result that is basically zero. Not because of irresponsibility, but because the expenses side of that equation has quietly grown enormous. Rent alone in most cities is consuming a huge percentage of what people bring home. Groceries have gone up significantly. Insurance costs have crept up. Transportation, healthcare, internet, phone plans, all of this stuff that isn't optional and isn't luxury spending. It's just the baseline cost of existing. And wages, for a lot of people, have not kept pace with any of that. And look, I want to be careful here because I don't want to just turn this into a complaint session. I think there's something more interesting and more useful to dig into, because when I started researching this idea, I came across something that genuinely surprised me. The problem with saving isn't just that there's nothing left over at the end of the month. The problem is that even when you do manage to save, the place you're saving your money might actually be losing you money in a way that's almost invisible. This is where inflation comes in. And I know that word gets thrown around a lot, but let me try to explain why it actually hit me differently once I thought about it in my own specific situation. Inflation is basically the rate at which prices go up over time, and it's measured as a percentage. So if inflation is running at, say, 3 or 4% in a year, that means the cost of things is going up by roughly that much. Your groceries, your rent, everything. Now here's the problem. A standard savings account at most banks is giving people somewhere around 0.5 to maybe 2% interest if they're lucky. Some people are getting less. So let's do the math together, because this is where my brain kind of broke a little. If inflation is moving at 4% and your savings account is giving you 1%, your money is effectively losing 3% of its purchasing power every single year. You're not breaking even. You're going backward. Slowly, quietly, but going backward. And I found this genuinely alarming because I had always thought of a savings account as a safe place, like the responsible, cautious thing to do. Put your money in the bank and it'll be fine. But fine compared to what? If inflation is eating into that money faster than the bank is paying you back, then keeping everything in a savings account isn't actually a neutral choice. It's slowly costing you. And this is the moment where I started feeling that mix of frustration and curiosity that drives most of these videos. Because if the advice to save money is genuinely good advice, but the mechanism we've been given to actually do it, the standard savings account, is losing value in real terms, then something in the system is off. Not off in a conspiracy theory way, just off in a practical, mathematical way that nobody really explained to me growing up. So what do people actually do about this? This is where I went down a research rabbit hole and started learning about how money actually moves in the broader economy. And I'll be honest, some of this is still new territory for me, but the basic idea is that money sitting in a savings account isn't doing much, it's just sitting there. Meanwhile, there's this whole infrastructure of financial institutions and investment vehicles where money is actively growing faster than inflation. Pension funds, for example, are giant pools of money that target returns of around 6 to 7% annually. That's why they can keep paying out to retirees. They're not keeping money in savings accounts. They're investing it across stocks, bonds, real estate, and other things that actually beat inflation over time. And mutual funds do something similar for regular people. You pool your money with thousands of other investors, and that pooled money gets put into a diversified basket of assets. The returns aren't guaranteed, but historically they've beaten what a savings account offers by a pretty significant margin over long periods of time. The S&P 500 index, for example, has historically averaged something like 7 to 10% annual returns when you account for inflation and reinvestment. Now here's where I want to pump the brakes, because this is the part where I got a little skeptical of my own discovery. Because the moment I start saying things like just invest your money, I run into the same wall that I think a lot of people in my situation run into. Invest with what? If the problem I identified at the beginning is that the formula produces zero at the end of the month, then having a conversation about investment accounts kind of assumes that there's money left over to invest. And that's not always the reality. This is where I had to sit with something uncomfortable. The problem might actually be layered. Layer 1 is the structural reality that costs have risen faster than incomes for a lot of people, which genuinely limits how much can be saved regardless of discipline. That's real, and it's worth acknowledging. But layer 2, which is the part I actually have some control over, is that even the small amount I am managing to put aside could be working harder than it currently is. And I think this is where the advice to save money starts to feel incomplete rather than wrong. The advice isn't bad. The habit of setting money aside, not spending everything you earn, building any kind of buffer, that's still valuable and still matters. But the way I was doing it, just dumping money into a savings account and feeling good about it, wasn't the full picture. It was like doing the first step of a two-step process and thinking I was finished. Here's the realization I kept coming back to. There are essentially two problems happening at the same time, and they require different responses. Problem 1 is cash flow. Can I actually create any margin in my monthly budget? This is the grind. Looking at income, looking at expenses, figuring out if there's any room to work with. And sometimes the honest answer is barely. But even barely matters here, because small amounts consistently over time actually do compound. That part of the conventional wisdom isn't wrong. Problem 2 is what I'm doing with whatever small amount I can set aside. And the answer to that probably needs to be something that at least keeps pace with inflation, if not beats it over time. So what does that look like practically when you're starting from basically nothing? This is still something I'm working through, but the direction that made the most sense to me is leaning toward low-cost index funds rather than a traditional savings account as the primary long-term vehicle, not instead of having any cash buffer, because you do need some accessible money for emergencies, but as the main place where money is supposed to grow over years and decades. A savings account earning below inflation is not the right tool. The reason index funds came up a lot in my research is that they're basically the low effort, low fee version of investing in a broad market. You're not picking individual stocks. You're not trying to time anything. You're just buying a slice of a large collection of companies and betting that the overall economy grows over the long run, which historically it has. And the fees on these are low enough that you're not giving up most of your returns to whoever manages the fund. Now, am I about to go dump every dollar I have into the market and call it a day? No, absolutely not. I genuinely don't have enough money right now to do anything dramatic. And there's also a real risk element to investing that I don't want to gloss over. The market goes down sometimes significantly. And if you need that money in the short term, that's a serious problem. So I'm not suggesting this as a get-rich-quick thing. I'm suggesting it as a slow, boring, realistic alternative to the savings account model that I thought was the only responsible option. The personal takeaway for me from all of this is pretty specific. I'm keeping a small amount of accessible cash in a savings account, but genuinely small, just enough to cover a couple of months of emergencies if something goes wrong. Everything else I can manage to set aside, even if it's a tiny amount every month. I'm planning to redirect into an index fund over time, not because I've cracked some secret code, just because I now understand that the goal isn't just to have money set aside. The goal is to have money that doesn't slowly lose its value while it's waiting to be needed. And here's the thing I keep coming back to, because I think it's kind of the emotional core of this whole video. I spent a long time feeling guilty about not saving enough, like it was a personal failure, a discipline problem. But when I actually looked at the math, I realized part of the reason it felt impossible is because the standard version of the advice is genuinely incomplete for someone starting from where I'm starting. It's not that saving is wrong. It's that saving money in a savings account and expecting it to work the way it worked decades ago when interest rates were higher and inflation was lower is a strategy that doesn't match the current reality. That doesn't mean you give up on the habit. You keep building the discipline of not spending everything. That part is still real and still necessary, but you pair it with a smarter destination for the money you're setting aside. I'm still early in figuring all of this out, and I'm sure I'm going to learn things that change how I think about it. But that's kind of the whole point of this channel, thinking through money stuff out loud in real time from a starting point that most financial advice just doesn't seem to be designed for. Next time, I want to dig into something that came up while I was researching this, which is this idea called compound interest. You've probably heard it called the eighth wonder of the world or whatever, which honestly made me roll my eyes a little. But then I started actually running the numbers on what it looks like over 20 or 30 years, even with tiny starting amounts. And I have some thoughts about both why it's more real than I expected and also where the advice around it tends to leave out a pretty important part of the story. That one should be interesting. If any of what I said today connected with you, let me know in the comments, especially if you've run into the same frustration of doing everything right and still feeling like you're barely moving. I genuinely love to hear how other people are thinking about this. And subscribe if you want to follow along, because I'm just getting started figuring all of this out, and there's a lot more to work through together.